Hey everybody, I am Kevin Iole from Yahoo Sports, and I guess I'm going to tell you a little bit of how old I am because I've covered the fights for a long time with this baby-faced guy next to me. I know I look old, he looks young, but we have covered the fights side by side for many, many years. My good friend Keith Idec of BoxingScene. How are you, Keith?
Hey, Kevin, how you doing, buddy?
I am.
I appreciate you calling me young, by the way, because, I don't feel it most days anymore, but I appreciate that.
Young compared to me anyway, so we will just go with that.
There
I
we
know
go.
you are in a home of your own now. You finally got a home in New Jersey. What is it like there with the virus? I mean, we hear so much about New York, but you guys are right there in the metropolitan area. What's it like for you in terms of all the craziness with COVID-19 going on?
It's unusual, obviously, I think, as it is for most people. Everyone's wearing masks and gloves and everything when they go to the store or whatever. And the streets, I live in a densely populated area in northern New Jersey. The town I live in only is about 12,000 people, but the highways are always crowded and the streets are always crowded. And now there are days when it just looks desolate and, people are afraid. There are, 60,000 plus cases of coronavirus here in New Jersey and, a lot of deaths compared to other states and everything. So, people are nervous but I think most people are adhering to the social distancing guidelines and most people are listening. So I think that's really helped flatten the curve, so to speak. We're starting to get there anyway. But people are afraid. I know people who've unfortunately lost family members and everything. Thankfully, no one in my family is sick or close friends of mine or anything are sick. But so many people have been impacted by it.
One of our friends, of course, Jimmy Glenn, one of the great boxing guys, just the news came out the other day that he actually has tested positive. Jimmy, I've seen various reports, 87, 88, 89 years old, but Jimmy's been around a long time. One of the really good guys, Jimmy's Corner, he owns Jimmy's Corner Bar in New York. Have you had a chance to talk to Jimmy or get any information on him?
I haven't spoke to Jimmy himself, but I have spoken to people who know him, yesterday, in fact, and he's doing pretty well. He seems to be okay, which is good news. But of course, being an older person, he's in the danger zone, so to speak. We just hope and pray that he's okay because he's really one of the classiest gentlemen that I've ever met in boxing, and obviously runs that bar in Manhattan that's very popular there near Times Square. So was a very good trainer and dealt with a lot of guys over the years. Just a really class act. So we just hope and pray that he's okay.
We will do that. While we're talking about this, let's talk about what impact the coronavirus is going to have on boxing, which is what we all love and can't wait to see kind of get back to normal. And I don't think it's going to be once President Trump keeps talking about opening up the countries and the governors say they're going to make the decision based on what the scientists say. But whenever that day comes when they say, okay, we're going to start to go back to work, do you believe we're going to have boxing right away, or do you think it's going to take a period of time? Because in my opinion, it's not going to happen right away because we're going to have to get fighters into gyms and back doing their training so that they can get ready for the fights. Even though there's guys, I'm sure, doing cardio and working out at home, it's not the same as being in a gym and preparing for an important fight.
That's the biggest obstacle, I think, Kevin, is that guys are not going to be in fighting shape right away. Most guys are saying that they're keeping in shape as best they can, with adhering to the social distancing guidelines and everything, but they're not really training for a fight. I mean, how could you? Who's sparring now when you don't have a fight set, and you're not supposed to have a lot of people around you? So that's the biggest obstacle, I think.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I mean, I think the thing is that there's going to be pressure on these fighters to let's go, let's be the first one out, let's get this thing going. But I think, from a number of reasons, number one, your career is short. You have to be ready when you fight. And I said this to Chris Mannix on his podcast last week, and I'll see if you agree. I think one of the things that's going to happen is going to be an upshot of this is that the fights that we want to see are going to be made a lot quicker because of this virus, because there's going to be so much competition for TV time, for media coverage, for viewer eyeballs, because when we do come back, think about it, NFL is going to be going on, MLB is going to be going on, then we're going to probably be in basketball and hockey playoffs, all the golf majors are now going to be in the fall. Everything is all going to be condensed into a much shorter time frame. So to me, I think, they're going to go to the bigger fights quickly, but I think that's incumbent then on the fighters to make sure that they don't take a fight until they're physically ready to do it. Do you agree?
Yeah, and I think the other thing, Kevin, is there's going to be a new economic reality for a lot of these fighters when we do come back. You know, this has obviously done a lot of damage to the American economy. We could be in the middle of something
Right.
worse than anything since the Great Depression, of course. But so I think a lot of the fighters are going to go into bigger fights and more challenging fights right away, but they're also going to have to, unfortunately for them, lower their economic
100%.
expectations. And that's not an easy thing to do, especially for guys who've been used to making X amount of dollars for those types of fights. So it's going to be challenging on both ends to make those fights right away. But I think we'll see less tune-up fights, and I think that'll make fans happy.
Here's one of the things, Keith, that I think, that UFC has over boxing. People talk about how much they pay the fighters, and at the very top, these boxers, Conor McGregor gets that kind of money in the UFC, and there's a few that do, John Jones and other ones. But uh, you see these fighters making, for like, I'll use HBO, they're no longer around, but HBO level fights, right? The fights that we would think would have been on HBO World Championship Boxing, making $3 and $4 and $5 million a fight. And that's good money. And are they drawn anywhere near that? And so a lot of times the license fee would come in and the entire license fee would go to maybe the A side. And the promoter's margins are so razor thin. So I think, UFC doesn't, they balance their payments out more across the board. So to me, I think it'd be better for the sport because you're still making, if you go from making 3 million and making 1 million, you're still making a heck of a lot of money, more than you would be doing anything else that you're doing. You're going to be in that top 1% of earners. And now the promoters are going to be able to put on some shows and put on quality and deep cards. What is your thought? And, I know you agree that, there's going to be fighters being forced to take that cut, but do you think it could actually be good for the sport?
Look, it's hard to convince guys to take less money under any circumstances, no matter what's going on. I think there does need to be some expectation adjustment, I guess, if that's the right term,
Right.
in terms of what some of these guys are looking to make. And I'll use the Errol Spence Terrence Crawford fight as a good example, because I think the primary reason why that fight hasn't even come close to happening yet is because the fighters want X. And I understand that they want X based on what they've been making for other fights. And this is clearly the most challenging fight for both guys. So they're kind of looking at it, well, like if I'm making $4 million to fight Kavalauskas or whomever else, I should make $15 million to fight Errol Spence or Terrence Crawford. Now, the problem is when the last mega fight that we did, Kevin, when we were ringside, what was it, 6 weeks ago, 7 weeks ago, whatever it was now for Wilder Fury 2, the fight didn't do nearly as well as they expected. On pay-per-view, it did a very good gate, but it didn't do as well on pay-per-view. So when that fight, maybe the most, one of the 2 or 3 most anticipated fights in the sport, only did what it did, then guys like Crawford and Spence are going to have to lower their expectations for that fight to finally become a reality. Are they willing to do that, or are we just never going to see that fight?
Yeah, that's interesting. I want to talk about that Wilder Fury fight from the business standpoint for a split second, Keith, because I have a theory and I want to see, and I share this, kind of with Todd DeBuff, and I see, you see like the ratings that Top Rank and ESPN have done on these boxing shows during the coronavirus pandemic. They showed the heavyweights last week and they got good ratings on those things. So people are interested in the product, and ESPN and Fox and Top Rank and the PBC, I thought, did a fabulous job promoting Wilder Fury 2. I mean, you could not have asked for better. They were everywhere. And if you didn't know that fight was happening, especially if you were even a casual boxing fan, your head was in the sand, right? I mean, so you had to know that it was going on, but yet they were expecting, maybe $1.25 million, and they got, 750, 800. So, while it's a good number, it's significantly less. And my feeling is that the audience is rebelling. It's not just the thievery of the pay-per-view. And of course, that is a factor. You're stealing money from the fighters by stealing the pay-per-view. But I also think what happened is, people are arguing at the promoters, you gave us no undercard, and you've done that for years, and we get tricked many, many, many years. And they feel like they've been cheated out of their money. And if you could convince them and say, hey, guys, we are going to all the time give you value for your dollar. We're going to not only give you a good main event, a good co-main event, but we're going to give you good fights on the main card, on the main pay-per-view card. They may not be, the greatest names in the world, but they're going to be evenly matched competitive fights. I think if you do that over a period of time, the fans will come back and they'll spend their money. Now, they may not spend it at $100 a pop, but I think that they'll come back and support the sport. Your thought?
Kevin, I think you make a really good point, but I think that most promoters are convinced that it does not matter what they put on the rest of the particularly the pay-per-view undercard, and we've seen evidence of that. They don't want to spend the type of money that it would require to say, remember when we had Lucas Matisse against Danny Garcia on the Canelo Mayweather undercard, one of the best fights you possibly could make on a pay-per-view undercard. It was a great fight. You know, Danny Garcia, people thought he was going to get knocked out. He winds up beating Lucas Matisse, arguably the biggest win of his career.
Who picked Danny Swift in that one?
Well, there you go. There you go. But it was a great fight for a pay-per-view undercard. They spent a lot of money on that fight, and they just didn't feel that it made enough of a difference in the pay-per-view returns to do things like that, because it hasn't happened since then. We haven't had
it didn't, but I think that's because promoters, it happens once in every great while, right? That's my argument. Do it consistently. You're going to have to sit there as a promoter, Bob Arum or Oscar De La Hoya or Lou DiBella or whoever, Eddie Hearn, whoever the promoter is going to be. I think they're going to have to, be willing to say a couple shows, no, we're going to have to show the audience that we're going to do this.
Mm-hmm. I think it makes sense, but it's a matter of convincing the people who are doing it to actually do it. Because one of those, if you're looking at a co-feature that could cost between $3 and $4 million, most promoters are not going to do that, because then you might have to convince the guys in the main event to take a little bit less. Also, I mean, to have the money for the pay-per-view undercard, and I don't think they're going to do that. It's interesting. I think the hardcore fans, Kevin, they really want quality and quantity of quality for their money on the undercards. And then the casuals, who is obviously a large portion of the audience they're trying to get, I don't think they really care one way or the other, because they're only going to watch the main event.
I think boxing has turned into a niche sport, obviously, over the last 50 or 60 years. And I think part of it is the behavior of the promoters, the promoters they're screwed in a lot of ways. The Muhammad Ali Act in boxing is, something that the UFC doesn't have to worry about, as an example. And that creates a whole set of issues for the promoters. But without going down that rabbit hole, I think that the promoters' behavior over time, and the fighters, hey, look, the fighters' insistence on these extraordinary paydays. I never had a problem with what Floyd Mayweather made. You know why? Because Floyd Mayweather sold the tickets, and he got a $70 million gate and all these things. Floyd Mayweather brought the people into the arena. So if you're doing that, God bless you. But if you're not doing those kind of numbers and you're asking for, like you mentioned, Spence and Crawford, $15 million, are you kidding me? I mean, so, cut that number down. And I think it's going, make the bottom people who are making, $100 around, pay them $500 around, and come down, and let's change this and improve it. That's what I think, Keith.
It's a valid argument, Kevin. It's just hard to convince these guys after they've been making so much money to take less, particularly for a fight of that magnitude. It's almost an impossible thing for the promoters to do, but it is something that they're going to have to address, or these fights are not going to get made.
Before we end this part of our discussion, Keith, I asked people on Twitter earlier, I put a hashtag Kevin Keith if they had a question that they wanted to ask us. And Omar, we got a couple questions. Omar asked one, and it's on this topic, so I'm going to ask you this now. He said, if boxing eventually starts again, but with non-attendance fights initially taking place, do you envision pay-per-view and subscription prices being increased to offset loss at the gate? I don't know if they're going to increase, because I don't think the public is going to buy that. So what's your thought? Do you think pay-per-view prices will go up after boxing returns?
I don't, because this is not the time to increase prices, of course. I don't think we'll see any movement in that. And I think the type of fights that we'll see in empty arenas and everything will be the types of fights that probably wouldn't do huge gates anyway. I don't think we'll see that. I don't think we'll see, like, I'll just use Crawford-Spence as an example. I don't think we'll see that anyway, but we wouldn't see that type of fight without fans in the arena, because you'd be giving too much up at the gate.
Right, correct. Canelo-GGG, their last fight, they had a $27 million gate. They are now agreed to fight each other a third time. That news came out a little bit ago. Canelo had also agreed to fight Billy Joe Saunders. That Billy Joe got himself into some trouble. The pandemic happened. So we don't know what's going on. My sense is that they may bypass Billy Joe and go straight to Triple G fight at middleweight. What are you hearing, Keith? And do you think that would be the move to make, to go Canelo Triple G?
I think that's what they'll do, because even though Canelo's not on pay-per-view anymore, where you're charging $80 or $90 for his fights, people want to see him fight Triple G. I think they'll go straight to that fight, because that's the biggest way DAZN can make a splash when they come back.
Right.
They don't want to have him fight Billy Joe Saunders. Billy Joe Saunders is a talented guy who gets up for the biggest fights, and I think he's a reasonable opponent for Canelo. but
I
not
agree.
the type of fight that they need in this first fight, their first big fight back. They need them to go straight to Canelo Triple G, and I think that's what they'll do in September.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And you talk about DAZN being able to sell subscriptions. They're losing people. You see the hashtag all the time. People put screenshots of canceling ESPN Plus or canceling DAZN because there's no fights on. I guess less on ESPN Plus because they have a bunch of archive content that isn't necessarily on DAZN. But people are canceling those. So I think Canelo Triple G is going to be a way to say, hey, come back. We're back, and we're going to have good content on there.
Yeah, I agree. And this is a fight people have wanted to see for a couple of years, and it should have happened before now. Canelo finally has relented, or DAZN has forced him, however you want to look at it. But the fight is going to happen now.
Right.
Triple G's to the point now where I think he's I don't want to say a faded fighter, but he's not what he was when they fought the first time for sure. So I think he's getting him at the right time, and Canelo obviously has gotten a lot better. So I think that was the right time for the fight to happen. I think, again, assuming we come back sooner rather than later, we'll see the fight in September.
I think there's a mental block for Triple G that he has to overcome in that fight too. I think he sits there and he goes, I fought 2 really good fights and I didn't beat this guy. And now, you see him on that upward trajectory. He beats Kovalev, he's won a super middleweight title. He's looked pretty good since he fought Gennady. And Gennady, hey, look, has fought 2 fights that I haven't been all that impressed by. Certainly Derevyanchenko gave him a much harder time than we thought. And so I wonder, I think mentally that's going to be a difficult challenge for Triple G, knowing, hey, I'm 2 years older now and I gave my best and it wasn't good enough. How do I overcome this?
Another thing to factor into it, Kevin, is how much did that Derevyanchenko fight take out of him? Because that was a hellacious fight. I mean, that I would honestly, I understand it's not nearly as high profile of a fight, but based on what I saw October 5th at Madison Square Garden, I would rather see Golovkin and Derevyanchenko fight again than I would rather see Canelo and Triple G fight a third time.
Fascinating.
Yeah, and I really thought that was the fight of the year last year. I know there were some other good candidates and everything, but that was nonstop action, just a terrific fight. I would love to see it again. But we don't know what's left of Triple G at this point, and well, we're going to find out in a few months. But
a lot of people were saying that he was sick against Derevyanchenko and that he went in the ring and he wasn't 100%. And, I know Gennady has fought in the past. Gabe Rosado, he was definitely sick. Abel Sanchez, sent me a picture when I was interviewing him, and he sent a picture of all the medicines against Gabe Rosado that Triple G was taking to be able to get in there and fight that fight. So he has fought diminished in the past. But do you buy that argument, or do you think that's somebody just trying to make Gennady's less than expected performance look good?
I'm not saying he wasn't sick. I have no idea. But I think it's taking away too much from Derevyanchenko to just say that the reason that fight was so competitive and so vicious on both ends of it was because he was sick. Derevyanchenko is a high-level fighter. He gave Danny Jacobs everything he could handle. That was his only loss before then. So I think I prefer not to take anything away from his performance that night.
No doubt. Do you feel like, I moved Canelo up when he beat Kovalev, and I know it wasn't the prime Kovalev, but I moved him up to my number 1 pound for pound. I had Terrence Crawford number 1, and I'm just looking, and I started thinking over time, look at who Canelo has beaten. And I felt like, that in and of itself deserved to put him on top, because I had Lomachenko, Crawford, and Canelo all, like kind of right there. And you could probably shake them up and pull names out of a hat. And, you've got a good list if you use those 3 guys. But I put Canelo on top because I said, you know what? And I know they won't care and it doesn't mean anything, but I think it encourages, if you say, hey, you're fighting the better competition, I'm going to reward you by ranking you higher. That's what we want. And I look at it, and he has beaten such high-level opposition, and he's fought everybody there is to fight. I mean, who has he not fought? He's fought everybody there is. And I'm not saying Crawford is ducking it. I'm not saying that at all. Crawford wants to fight these fights, but he hasn't had the same level of opposition that Canelo has had.
I can certainly see the argument, Kevin, for either of those 3 guys being at the top of anyone's list. I mean, you could clearly make that argument well for Canelo, for Lomachenko, and for Terrence Crawford. Personally, I have Terrence Crawford at the top of my list, and I realize that people have legitimate arguments about his overall level of competition. But I've had Terrence Crawford at the top of my list, and I've kept him there. Canelo certainly has improved. you couldn't have any beef whatsoever with his resume. Look at the guys that Canelo has fought. And I don't, a lot of people say, oh, well, Kovalev was shot and he was cherry picked. You don't move up 2 divisions and cherry pick, so to speak. I mean, it was still impressive what he did. And Kovalev actually gave him a very competitive fight before he got knocked out. The fight was close, but, he moved up 2 weight classes for that fight. So I give him a lot of credit for that. The Rocky Fielding fight, not so much, of course. But I think, if he were to fight Billy Joe Saunders, he could legitimize himself as a super middleweight champion, whereas now people don't really consider him a legit 4-division champion because Rocky Fielding was the secondary champion and had been knocked out by Callum Smith, the real champion. So, I can see the argument for Canelo being number 1, but I have Crawford at the top of my list. He's, Crawford's undefeated. I understand that Canelo's loss came, well, really his last loss came against Golovkin in the first fight, but not technically, I guess. But he hasn't lost in
7 years ago against Mayweather.
Right. It's a long time. 6.5. I think it was right September 13. But it's a long time not to have lost the fight, of course. But there are other things about Canelo. Canelo has failed a PED test and was suspended for 6 months. I mean, there are other factors to consider there. Also, I think Lomachenko is a really gifted guy. But I still have Crawford number 1.
I want to say this because, it got a lot of attention in UFC space because they have a full-time drug testing program and not so much in the boxing space. But California put thresholds in, and USADA is using those in the UFC testing. And as I understand it, Canelo's clenbuterol was below the threshold. So if he had been tested now and had that same number, it would not have been a violation. So just to, for him,
right.
I think that's fair to point out the fact that, when it first happened, we didn't know, and there was all this uncertainty. But I think that actually does, in his defense, I was critical of him before, and I thought, oh, BS, everybody says they didn't do it, you did it. But now that, they ate the contaminated meat, given what the levels he had were, that and the fact that it wouldn't be a violation at this point, gives credence to his defense.
Yeah, I mean, make a strong argument, Kevin. But one thing I will say, I don't know what he ate and what he did not eat. Right. What I do know is that he was suspended for 6 months, and their rematch was pushed back. I mean, that's indisputable.
Yeah, no question about it. Well, let's move on. One of our other questions is about the Lomachenko-Teofimo Lopez fight. Wun asks who we have in the fight. But before we talk about who we have in the fight, that was scheduled for May 30th. Let's talk about when we might see that fight and if it is too soon for Teofimo, who is now a world champion. One of my favorite fighters to watch, just not only an entertaining guy in the ring, but a charismatic kid. I think has a chance to be a really, really big star. He has it all in my mind. But he's going up against a guy with 400 plus fights. And I realize most of those were his amateurs, but Loma is a tough nut to crack. Do you think this is a little early in Teofimo's career to take that particular fight?
I don't think it is, and I'm not comparing Richard Comey to Lomachenko, but Comey, no one had come close to doing to Richard Comey. Now, he's not nearly as complete a fighter as Lomachenko, but he had only lost 2 split decisions before that, and Teofimo Lopez went in there and destroyed him, right? I mean, he had done – not even the top-ranked matchmakers expected him to do to Comey what he did. So that performance kind of showed me – after his previous performance was a little lackluster and went the distance and everything, that performance really showed me that he was ready for that type of fight. He's young, he's only 22 years old. He only has 15 fights. He's 21, I think, actually, not even 22 yet. But yeah, I mean, he's a young kid, but he's got a lot of confidence. He's very entertaining. I spoke to him for a few weeks ago to answer part of your question, and he feels like the fight, because everything has been delayed so much and Top Rank has a lot of other big fights on the books that they have to schedule, he doesn't feel like they'll fight until October or November. And I think one of the primary issues as far as that goes for Lomachenko is he won't have, just for argument's sake, say they fight in October, Kevin, he won't have fought in about 13 or 14 months.
Yeah,
and
August when he fought Luke Campbell would have been the last fight.
And I don't think he's going to want to go into that type of fight on that kind of a layoff. Now, Lopez won't have fought, for about 10 months himself, but it kind of complicates things a little more than it was if they were to fight on May 30th.
Yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, Well, I think the fact that Teofimo can work with his father, and they can at least do pads and some things, and work on stuff in this time frame, that'll maybe help him. I just think that to me, breaking down the fight, I mean, I think the biggest nut to crack for Teofimo is that footwork that Lomachenko has, and he's so difficult, and he gives you those angles, and it, like, you don't know where the punches are coming from, and it's B, where he's going to be, and so to hit him and set your stuff up is going to be difficult. And I think the more time that Teo has to kind of work on that and try to figure that out, that puzzle out, I think the better chance he'll have of winning it.
Right, because at what point would Lopez get frustrated if he can't touch him the way that he's used to touching people? And he won't, because he's such a complicated guy to fight. His footwork is amazing, as you well know. I mean, he's a tough guy, to figure out. And how long will it take Lopez to hit him with a good shot? But when he does, what happens? Because this kid has freakish power. And when he does touch Lomachenko, who's not the biggest lightweight in the world, what happens when he does get to him?
Right.
That's the fight, right? I mean, that's the fight in a nutshell, right?
Yeah, I'll tell you what. I think when you think about it, I think who are the fighters that I've seen that have the best footwork, and by far to me, number one is Floyd Mayweather. I think Floyd Mayweather, tremendous footwork. Number two, Guillermo Rigondeaux, and the time that I've covered boxing, and I've covered it, and I thought of Sugar Ray Leonard and some of these other guys, but I think Guillermo Rigondeaux, and then I would say, Vasyl Lomachenko, those three guys, had such great feet. And that is so important in this sport, that, when you have everything else that Lomachenko has going for you, those feet just make you a special fighter. And I think he is a really special fighter.
Yeah, he really is. And the shame about Rigondeaux is his footwork is also incredible. But I've never seen a guy with that type of talent, certainly since I've been covering the sport, a guy who's at that elite level take as much crap as Rigondeaux has. I mean, from promoters, from fans. The guy's an extremely talented guy. And I understand sometimes he hasn't been the most engaging guy in the ring, and that's hurt his cause a little bit. But it just seems like he's not appreciated nearly as much as he should be.
Yeah, I think what happened in boxing, and hey, look, I'm as guilty of it as anybody else. You want to see fights, not boxing, right? And then you want to see guys getting, like the fights what are my favorite fights? Morales and Barrera, and Marquez and Vasquez, and Pacquiao and Marquez, and those kind of fights where there's I like that there's skill involved. That's why I rate some of these other fights higher than, say, Gotti and Ward, because I think the skill of those other fighters is a little bit higher than Mickey and Arturo was, right? I mean, the action in Mickey and Arturo was great, but I always say, theoretically, Keith, it's easier to hit a lower skilled fighter than it is to hit a higher skilled fighter. So when you take a Morales, Barrera, a Pacquiao, Marquez, a Marquez, Vasquez, etc., and you make it that kind of fight, that the skill level it just gives it the advantage when you're comparing.
Well, as a Jersey guy, I'm not going to take offense to
I saw that smile
about Arturo Gatti and Mickey Ward, but I was there ringside for that fight, and it was amazing stuff. And I know you're not dogging obviously what they did, but and the one fight that, speaking to your point, the one fight that you didn't mention, and I'm sure it was just not an intentional omission, but the Corrales Castillo fight, which we just saw the other night, which was like I went back and watched it a couple of times. I did a piece for BoxingScene on Friday about Joe Goossen's perspective, and Tony Weeks, who was a referee,
right,
and Al Bernstein, who called the fight from ringside. But the skill level that they fought at for such a sustained period of time, even without the 10th round, which was one of the most incredible things that any of us have ever seen in boxing, that fight for the first 9 rounds was epic. Just by the
unbelievable.
They fought in a phone booth for 9 rounds before any of that crazy stuff happened. But to your point, Kevin, I understand what you're saying. I mean, to fight it, Morales, Barrera won. I mean, Jesus, it's just incredible. Vasquez and Marquez 3 was absurd. So many good fights to speak to. But we're a little preferential here in Jersey to Gatti Ward for sure.
I saw that smile come up as I was talking when I mentioned Gatti. I knew what was coming, so
I don't want to send anyone after you. Come on, man.
I want to mention Corrales Castillo, because I think the best fight I ever covered. and I talked to Michelle Corrales last week. I talked to Tony Weeks and Joe Goosen as well. And I talked to Michelle Corrales. And for people who didn't see my story, you can catch it on Yahoo Sports. But I thought Michelle Corrales had some unbelievable comments. And the two things I wanted to mention, she said that when the rematch was scheduled, it was too early. So they fought in May, and then the rematch was made in October. And here's what I thought was really fascinating. She said that Diego knew it was too early. And she said when he started training, his eyes were both still black and blue. And she said a couple of things happened. You know, he started preparing her for what may happen in the rematch. And he said, you know, I love you and I always love you, blah, 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 blah. And this fight, you know, he was preparing to go in and potentially die. That's how he knew what that first fight took out of him. And secondly, he wanted to have kids so bad at that point. So he really started rushing, she said, to have children because he wanted to have that legacy. And, you know, the fact that he did that, you know, kind of was, he knew what he had gone through. And he died 2 years to the day after that great fight with Castillo. But my Lord, you know, we don't sometimes think of the after effects and the human carnage aspect of this sport. And Michelle Corrales, I encourage you to read my piece on it because what she said gives you a whole new respect for what the fighters go through.
Yeah, I did read it, Kevin. And the thing is, like, you know, with Corrales just went through so much in that fight. And as you said, he wasn't really ready to go back into training. That was among the things that Joe told me. When he came back to camp, he knew it was way too soon. It was less than 3 months. He started camp for the rematch. He said they should have taken a year off at least before they fought anyone else, much less each other. And he said he still had swelling around, not swelling, but like, you know, puffiness around his eyes and everything. He just was not ready for camp for that fight. You know, one thing I thought was amazing about the second fight, third fight never happened because of Castillo's nonsense, but But and I saw a video the other day, by the way, of the third fight at the weigh-in where Diego was going crazy because, you know, he came in 5 pounds overweight, and I saw a younger Kevin Iole in the fold there doing some interviewing during the scrum.
Was there a little? A
little bit more. I know how that goes now, unfortunately, but they kind of picked up in the first 3 rounds of that fight. They sort of picked up where they left off 5 months before that, and then he just caught him with that left hook that ended the fight pretty abruptly. But if I could, Kev, just one thing related to Corrales and just how incredible that fight was. I was not at ringside for the fight, but the following week I went to Las Vegas for the Winky Wright Trinidad fight.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure you were there for this also. But Gary Shaw, who was Corrales' co-promoter, rented like this huge apartment in MGM Grand. And we watched the Corrales-Castillo fight with Corrales.
Yeah.
And it was the first time that he had really seen the fight in its entirety. And I was kind of sitting behind him over his right shoulder, and he still had sunglasses on. It was 5 days after the fight. Just to watch the fight with him in the room and see his natural reactions to seeing it the first time, it was one of the greatest experiences I've had covering boxing for sure.
Yeah, that is really, I remember that very well. And I remember running into him in Las Vegas, and it was like he was an old man walking. I actually saw him at a grocery store, and I saw him, and it was like he was an old man. I mean, you know, what was he, 29 years old or 28 years old? Yeah. He was a young guy, and the way he was moving, because his body was so sore and beaten up, it was pretty remarkable. And Diego, you know, R.I.P., we all loved him. He was such a great, you know, person. And he loved the fights himself. You know, he loved the essence of what boxing is. What a guy. Hey, and I want to wrap up. I really appreciate your time. Just one or two other topics, Keith. And the one thing I wanted to run past you, you know, we were talking about, you said they shouldn't have fought anybody for a year. 100% agree. I want to ask you, Deontay Wilder, do you think it was wise of Deontay Wilder and his team to take that rematch with Fury? Because I agree with the same thing you said about Castillo and Corrales. I think applies to Deontay. You know, a true warrior, a guy that, you know, will never say, I've had enough. You know, he said the same thing. I want to die in there. I don't want to have anybody stopping my fight. But he took brutal punishment over 7 hard rounds from Tyson Fury when they fought in February. And he was going to go in July, now tentatively set for October. Do you think that's a wise move on his part to get back in there so quickly and not let his body heal a longer period of time?
Well, he did take some punishment in the fight. I agree with you, but he didn't take nearly the type of punishment that Corrales and Castillo took in their fight, I don't think, because there was just such sustained action in that fight. They were constantly hitting each other with hard shots to the body and the head. Not that that's, you know, the only comparison you could make. He did take punishment in the fight. But I don't know if it's the wisest thing for him to do, Kevin, but I think it's the necessary thing for him to do, because he can't relinquish control of having this third fight with Tyson Fury. Because if he goes and allows Tyson Fury to fight someone else,
Right.
and someone upsets Fury, or if they both go fight someone else and he gets picked off by a guy he's supposed to knock out, well, then he never gets the third fight. So contractually has control of the situation now. So I think whether the rematch was in July or in October, he had to do it, also because he's guaranteed so much money for the third fight. I don't really think he had any other alternatives. There were, and you've heard this also, Kevin, where Eddie Hearn in the beginning was saying, well, what if we came up with step-aside money for Deontay Wilder and it could allow Fury to fight Joshua? It would depend on how much step-aside money he were offered. I mean, you're talking $5 million, $15 million. You know, the Saudi money is so outrageous sometimes. Maybe they could have paid him so much to just sit out and then be guaranteed to fight the winner, that might have made financial sense for him, assuming he would definitely get the winner with no questions asked in the next fight. But that's not happening. So I think he did the only thing that he could do here. And now the question is whether he's going to be able to make the technical adjustments before the third fight that could help him win it.
So I'll end with this. You know, in the last year, both AJ and Deontay Wilder have lost in a bad way. I kind of thought going into the second Fury fight that Wilder was the number one heavyweight in the world, Fury was number 2, and AJ was number 3. Did anything that happened in that second Fury Wilder fight change your opinion of how they rank, and how do you rank those 3 heavyweights right as we sit right now?
You'd probably have to put Joshua above Wilder at this point, just because, you know, he came back. It wasn't the most scintillating performance, but he did come back and did what he needed to do to beat Andy Ruiz. He got his titles back. So I think, yeah, you'd have to rank them Fury, Joshua, Wilder. But Wilder still, you know, the thing is, you know how it goes, Kevin. A guy loses, people write him off forever. He's, you know, he was this, he was that. You know, but remember before this fight, people were talking about him being the most devastating puncher in the history of boxing. You know, he had knocked out almost everyone that he had fought. So I think that'll motivate him going into this fight. And he still has freakish power. So you can't, no matter what happened in the second fight, and it was ugly for sure, but I don't think you could discount his chances in the third fight, because he still has that pulverizing power. That's not going to change from February to October. So I think, you know, I'm interested in seeing the third fight, as I'm sure you are. And I think enough fans will be to make it a big event again, not necessarily as big as the rematch, but I'm looking forward to seeing what he does in the set, because he can't just lay back and allow Tyson Fury to do whatever he wants. He better make some strategic changes, or he's going to get beat up again.
Yeah, I think we saw from the first fight to the second, Fury made the adjustment. He said, hey, I'm going to come forward and I'm going to take your time and space away, and I'm going to make you fight going backwards. And obviously Wilder really had difficulty doing that. I think it's incumbent upon Deontay. The thing I think is, you know, he and JD just work on that footwork, you know, get that footwork going to throw that jab. I think Deontay has quick feet, Keith, and I think he's good at setting his feet and throwing that right hand. But I don't think he gets his feet into punching position to really like George Foreman had that powerful jab, and Foreman would hit you, and it was like you were being hit by a right hand, right, just by his jab. And I think, you know, that's why when Michael Moorer went out against Foreman, I mean, it was like jab, right hand. That jab, you know, stunned him, let alone the right hand that came behind it. I think Deontay could have that kind of jab if he worked on his feet and kind of was in position to throw that jab. Then that makes his right hand so much better. So to me, that's what's incumbent upon him going into the next fight. I guess, you know, they fought almost 19 full rounds, and, you know, Fury's really won 17 of those 19. I think it's going to be a tall order for Deontay to overcome that. But like you say, that punching power is incredible.
Yeah, Fury has proved himself to be the better fighter over the course of their 2 fights, for sure. And he's beaten Deontay Wilder both ways. He outboxed him in the first fight. You know, I thought he won that fight, as you probably did, and most other people. You know, he outboxed him in the first fight. He outmuscled him in the second fight. So he's got a lot of confidence going into the third fight. Another thing I think that Wilder needs to do, Kevin, is when they get inside, he's got to do some things differently inside to not let Tyson Fury's physicality do what it did to him in the second fight, because that drained his energy, probably more so than the costume or whatever else he has said. And you can't allow him to put you in front face locks and lean on you at 275 pounds almost. You can't allow him to do that. So he's going to have to figure out some ways inside to do different things to not let Fury do that.
Well, listen, my pal, the Iron Sheik, can give him some talk about how to grapple him out, so we can work on that. Keith, I appreciate
Absolutely.
you. It's been a long time. I really
Absolutely,
appreciate you
man.
doing this. For people who want to follow you on social media, Twitter and Instagram, where can they follow you?
Yeah, it's just Idec Boxing. At my Twitter handle is just my last name, IDEC Boxing. I don't have an Instagram account, probably because I'm old, I guess, but but I don't have one, so yeah, so
All
they
right.
can't follow me there. But.
Sounds very good. Well, I appreciate it. That is my friend Keith Idec, one of the best in the business, and
Thanks, guys.
I am Kevin Iole. Appreciate it, everybody.